So today's video is going to give us a quick overview of fertilization as well as kind of the stages of pregnancy and a little bit of development of the growing embryo and fetus. Okay, so we're going to start with fertilization. So fertilization officially is just when the oocyte and the sperm come together. They'll fuse together to produce a zygote. And in humans, that zygote is now going to have 46 chromosomes, just like a normal human cell will. Because remember, the oocyte had 23, the sperm had 23. They come together now to form these 23 pairs, or for a total of 46 chromosomes. The oocyte must be fertilized within 24 hours of ovulation. So the sperm, if you remember from our kind of intro discussion, the sperm can live for up to 5 days in the reproductive tract, sometimes longer. So the sperm can live for days in the female's reproductive tract, but the egg needs to be fertilized within 24 hours of its release from the ovary. Therefore, intercourse could occur a few days prior to ovulation and a pregnancy could still result because the sperm are still viable within the reproductive tract for a few days. So the sperm have to travel all the way to the far end of the fallopian tubes or the uterine tubes. So the sperm, as most of you realize, right, you know what they're shaped like, right? They have this flagellum. Okay, flagella plural, right? So they have this tail that helps them to travel. And so they need to travel a very, very long distance for a cell, right? They need to get all the way to the end of the fallopian tube because that's where fertilization actually occurs. So this is actually happening in those uterine or fallopian tubes. So fertilization does not occur in the uterus. It occurs in the tubes, and then the fertilized egg will then travel to the uterus to implant. So the sperm will, once they reach the oocyte, they go through a process called capacitation. And so capacitation is when the sperm is actually able to penetrate the layers of the oocyte and fertilize it. So it's where the sperm is actually finally able to access the egg and then they can fuse together. So if you look in your diagram here, you'll see that this egg cell has a variety of layers protecting it, right? You don't even get to the cell membrane until here, right? This layer here is the cell membrane. So the sperm cells have to go all the way through these layers to the cell membrane for fertilization to actually occur. So this capacitation process is the act of them actually kind of drilling through the layers of the egg cell and then the actual fusion of the nucleus between the sperm and the egg cell. So for the sperm to get through the layers around the egg, they release a chromosomal enzymes. Okay, and so here's your spelling right here. Okay, so the sperm cell will release the enzymes, and those enzymes are what are going to wear away this protective coating. You can see how some of these sperm cells are further in than others. So that those chromosomal enzymes are what are going to actually wear away the outer layers there of the oocyte. So those are released as soon as the sperm reaches the outermost layer, which is this zona pellucida. So that's going to trigger the release of those chromosomal enzymes. And it's going to take enzymes from lots of sperm to actually make a hole all the way through. Okay, so the first sperm to reach the egg is not the one that's going to end up fertilizing it because you need hundreds of sperm to help have enough enzymes to drill a hole all the way through that zona pellucida layer to get to the oocyte membrane. So it's really a sperm that arrives later is the one that is actually going to be able to do the actual fertilization. And so it's one of those later arriving sperm, like this one up here up top, that are able to actually get through the opening then, and they're going to fuse with this. So the sperm cell membrane will fuse with the oocyte cell membrane, and then the nucleus of the sperm, because that's where the DNA is going to be, right? So the nucleus of the sperm is actually going to enter the oocyte. And that's what you're seeing in this diagram here. This purple right there, that is the nucleus of the sperm. entering, because remember it contains the DNA, so it's entering to then join with the nucleus of the egg cell. You can see here now how I have a diploid nucleus, right, with the pairs of chromosomes. Okay, and the human body has some built-in mechanisms to help prevent what we call polyspermy. Polyspermy would be having more than one sperm be able to have their nucleus enter the oocyte of the female, right? Because we don't want extra DNA. That's not a benefit, and we don't like that. So what will happen is when that sperm that is able to get down to the oocyte, when those membranes fuse together, that will cause an influx of sodium. So the sperm cell actually binding to the membrane, so the fusion of the sperm cell membrane and the oocyte membrane together are going to cause an influx of sodium into the oocyte. So sodium influx, let's be clear that this is going into the egg. All right, so we open sodium channels just like we did with neurons. Right, so sodium comes flying into the oocyte. That is then going to trigger a calcium release. Again, this is similar to muscle cells and neurons. Remember, in muscle cells, we release the calcium. So the sodium comes in, calcium is released. That's going to reactivate meiosis. Remember, the female egg hasn't fully completed meiosis, so that reactivates meiosis. When that meiosis gets reactivated, the egg then releases another protective coating that the other sperm are not able to bind to. Okay, so let's see, reactivates meiosis, oocyte, then releases a protective coating. So now we don't have any more sperm that are able to fuse with the oocyte membrane, so we won't have any more DNA being released into the egg cell. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about pregnancy, which is also what's called gestation. Okay, and so we're going to hit a lot of vocabulary here. There's like a period of time where every time the cells in when the cells in the growing and developing baby, every time they change number, they get a new name. So we just kind of need to, it's helpful, I think, to just remember them in order, right? And just kind of work your way through them. Okay, so gestation lasts approximately 265 days. That's from fertilization until the time the baby is born. When they determine a due date for a female, it's usually based on their last menstrual cycle, because ovulation is usually about 2 weeks after. And so from the date of the last menstrual cycle, they count out about 280 days. And that's where they kind of determine the due date from. But the actual gestation is usually about 265, right? From the fertilization to the actual birth. So we have this fertilized zygote now that is remember the egg was released, the fimbriae swept it into the uterine tube, and then fertilization occurred at this far end of the uterine tube. So now I have this zygote. So that's kind of phase one here. It's got all the chromosomes it should have, half from mom, half from dad, and it's going to be dividing as it continues to travel to the uterus. And it's going to take a few days for it to get to the uterus. It could take 4 to 5 days for it to get all the way down the fallopian tube into the uterus. So as this zygote begins to grow and develop, it'll reach a stage that we call the morula. This is about 3 days in. There are 16 cells in this phase. So basically what's happening is the cells have been doubling. So this is a 16 cell phase. And this is going to happen, like I said, about 3 days in, right before the fertilized egg gets to the uterus to be ready for implantation. From there, that morula is going to develop into what's called a blastocyst. Okay, and so a blastocyst is going to be where the cells start to kind of get pushed off to one side. You can see all the cells over on one side, and we develop this cavity here inside the blastocyst, and it's going to fill with fluid. So inside that morula clump of cells, all the cells kind of start to get pushed to one side, and we get a fluid-filled cavity within there. That blastocyst is what's actually entering the uterus and what's actually implanting. It releases that zona pellucida, remember that protective layer that was on the outside. It releases that zona pellucida so that that blastocyst can now implant into the uterus. And you can see it here implanting into the endometrium. And then we have this clump of cells here. So this will be about 7 days in when we get implantation into the functional layer there of the uterus. And so I'm going to have in this blastocyst, I'm going to have two parts. I'm going to have what we call the inner cell mass. And so that's going to be this big clump of cells here. And then the trophoblast. And the trophoblast is going to be basically the other side, right? That layer of cells around the cavity. Okay. And so this will happen about 2 weeks or so after fertilization. So the blastocyst has embedded into the endometrium. The endometrium grows around it. You'll see how the endometrium here has grown around, kind of holding that in. So it doesn't just implant on one side. The mother grows cells around it, so it is fully surrounded by the mom's cells. And that's going to be important for growth and development, getting enough nutrients to these growing cells. And so it'll be fully implanted in after about 2 weeks after fertilization, about 12 days. And that trophoblast is going to start secreting human chorionic, you've probably heard of this, gonadotropin hormone, or HCG. It's what they test for when they do a pregnancy test. They're measuring the levels of this hormone. Again, it's commonly called HCG. And so what HCG does is it helps maintain the pregnancy. So if you remember, when the female released that egg, right, from the ovary, the follicle that the egg was contained in, remember, it became that corpus luteum, and that corpus luteum was secreting progesterone. And so what the HCG does is it maintains the pregnancy by maintaining that corpus luteum. It doesn't let that corpus luteum break down like it does if an egg isn't implanted. And so we keep releasing these high levels of these female hormones like progesterone and estrogen to help maintain the pregnancy. And so the embryo at first is going to be getting its nutrients straight from diffusion. So simple diffusion, the tissue from the mom, right, is wrapped all the way around these cells, and there's not that many of them. And so we can have simple diffusion, just getting the nutrients into the from the endometrium into the embryo. After a while, though, that becomes not enough, and the development of the placenta needs to occur. So the placenta's role is to provide nutrients to the fetus. It is officially an organ. It's going to grow in the uterus because the diffusion isn't going to supply enough nutrients. And so that embryo is going to develop into a fetus after about 8 weeks. Okay? And that's when this placenta is really going to need to be, kind of ready to go. So the placenta develops along the walls of the uterus. You can see it here. This officially is the placenta there. Okay. It will start to pump blood through the. Okay, let's back up a second. All right. So the heart is one of the first organs to form in the baby. It's why it's a common, when you see on your TV shows, or if you know anybody that's pregnant, it's one of the things you listen to and stuff pretty much right away. And so a few weeks after fertilization, the heart will start to pump blood through the blood vessels within the embryo. So the blood vessels are starting to grow and develop in the embryo, and the heart is starting to pump them through it. And so this is all going to help. The placenta is going to be providing the food and the oxygen from the mother. And then it's also going to be a place where the baby's CO2 can be removed, because remember, the baby's going to be surrounded by fluid, so it's not breathing on its own. So the placenta is going to be providing these nutrients and helping remove this waste. And the fetus is going to also help circulate the nutrients through its own developing organs that are coming from the placenta. So the nutrients from the mother's blood are going to diffuse into the fetal blood capillaries through the umbilical cord, right? So we have umbilical cord, which will have umbilical arteries and umbilical veins, right? And the umbilical arteries and veins, we're not going to get into how they're named. They're like pulmonary arteries and veins. They're a little weird because it's based off the fetus. And so again, we're not going to go there right now. Just the umbilical cord is going to contain those arteries and veins, which are going to transport, blood back and forth and nutrients back and forth between the mother and the fetus. And so the fetus is going to be surrounded by this amniotic sac. Right? And so the amniotic sac is, you can see that it's like the blue here. Okay, all of this is our amniotic sac here, and it's going to be filled with amniotic fluid. And it's going to have an inner layer, which is going to be the amnion. I know this is spelled in your picture, but this is probably just as fast. So it has this inner layer, which is the amnion, and then the chorion, which is our more outer layer of it. Both of these came from the fetus. So both of those come from fetal tissues. And then the outermost layer that is attached, that is out touching the walls of the uterus, is the decidua capsularis. There's your spelling of it right there. That one was easy to find. So the decidua capsularis, that's coming from the mother's tissues. And so all of this together is going to help house the baby, keep the baby safe, protected, and getting the nutrients that it needs while it's rapidly growing and developing. So once the baby is grown and fully developed, we have to get the baby out, right? We have to go through childbirth. So childbirth is called parturition, right? And so what's going to be happening during childbirth is the uterine walls, the muscle in the uterus, is going to be responding to hormonal changes in the mother, and it's going to be causing contractions to help force the baby out. So what will happen is fetal oxytocin. So oxytocin is a hormone. So fetal oxytocin will cause the uterus to start contractions. And so what will happen is, and then the mother will also start to release oxytocin from the pituitary gland. So what will happen is the uterus will start to contract. And the uterus, if you remember how it's shaped like kind of like this, right? And the baby's head is supposed to be ready. We're ready for one of my amazing drawings, right? The baby's head is supposed to be pointing down, right? Because the baby's going to be forced out down. And so all of this, remember the uterus has these big, thick muscles, right? So that when they contract, they're going to push down like this so that the baby will be forced out through the bottom, out through the cervix. And so when the uterus contracts, the baby's head will start to push on the cervix here. And so that will cause the cervix to start to open up. As the cervix opens up, that causes the release of more oxytocin. More oxytocin causes more contractions. This is an example of a positive feedback loop. Remember we talked about positive and negative feedback loops? Negative feedback loops, we're basically doing the opposite of the stimulus. Positive feedback loops, we're encouraging the stimulus to keep happening. So what we have is uterine contractions cause the release of oxytocin, and oxytocin causes more, stronger uterine contractions. And this cycle will continue until we have full dilation and the baby is completely delivered. So looking at our 3 stages of labor, we have dilation. Dilation is going to start with the contractions. So with those uterine contractions, and the end of dilation is officially when the cervical canal is fully widened. I'm sure you've heard this again in your medical shows and stuff where they talk about they're measuring it. You're at a 2, you're at a 4, you're at a 6, you're at an 8, you're fully dilated. This is usually the longest stage of labor because this is kind of we're getting that feedback system going, right? The baby's head is pushing on the cervix. We release more hormones. We do more contractions. The baby's head pushes a little bit more, right? And so it just is opening up, getting ready for the actual expulsion, which is the second phase. So this is the actual delivery of the baby. So this is usually pretty quick once the mother has reached full dilation, as long as there's no issues and nothing is wrong. Once the mother has reached full dilation, this is usually pretty quick, usually less than an hour. This is also when the umbilical cord comes out and is clamped or cut. Okay, the final part is the placental delivery. And so after the baby is delivered, the uterus will still continue to contract so that the placenta will detach and be expelled. So we can see the placenta here, because remember the placenta is attached to the umbilical cord, right? And the placenta is no longer needed if there is no longer a baby housed in the womb. And so the mother's body will deliver that placenta usually 20 to 30 minutes or so after the baby has been delivered. Okay, and then one of the final changes will be the lactation process in the mother. So, lactation is the actual production of milk by the mother, and the milk is going to contain amino acids that the baby needs. So, amino acids to build proteins, right? So, the baby can use those to build proteins. It's going to contain fats, carbohydrates, or sugars, vitamins, antibodies that the mother is producing. Okay, it will also contain anything else the mother consumes. If the mother is consuming alcohol, if the mother's consuming drugs, medicines, it doesn't matter. It will all of that will end up in the mother's milk, which can be transferred to the baby. Okay, there are two main hormones involved in lactation. So we have prolactin first, which is actually important for the production of the milk. And so prolactin levels are going to go up near the end of pregnancy so that the mammary glands can start to produce the milk so that there's milk ready and available as soon as the baby is born. So prolactin levels are going to start to rise in late pregnancy. And then oxytocin again is important in what's called the letdown reflex. So oxytocin is important for the actual release of the milk when the baby is ready to feed. So we can see here the stimulus is the baby attaching, okay? And so the suckling, the pressure on the nipple and the baby attaching is going to trigger the hypothalamus, which will then trigger the release of the prolactin to make more milk and the oxytocin to release the milk. And so again, as long as everything is functioning properly, the mother should make plenty of milk to feed the baby essentially for as long as she wants. As long as she continues either nursing or pumping, that will tell the body that she needs to continue to make milk. Okay, and so that is going to kind of wrap up our what really is pretty brief overview of our reproductive system.